Hey, fourth graders. My name is Mr. Barry, and if you haven't had the chance to watch a video with me yet, um, I will be teaching you all online science and social studies this year. If you want to know a little bit about me, go take a look at the science video I posted as well. I went through and told you a little bit about myself in that video. In this video, though, we are going to be talking about social studies. For social studies this year, we're going to be doing a lot with primary and secondary sources. So that's how we're going to start off our year. We're going to learn what the difference is between a primary source and a secondary source. So real quick, I'm going to read a little bit to you about a primary and secondary source. A primary source is something that was made, said, written, or used by someone who was at an event when it happened. A secondary source is something made, said, written, or used by someone who was not at an event when it happened. There are different kinds of primary and secondary sources. They can help us to learn the story of a place and how people lived. So in this video, we're going to be learning more about the primary and secondary sources and talking about examples of each. What you're going to need is simply a pencil and a piece of paper, preferably a notebook that you guys are going to be taking notes in for science and social studies this year. If you need to go grab that, pause the video and do that now. If you already have it, great. Let's get started. So let me share my screen with you. And when you have your piece of paper, what I would like you to do is fold it in half and draw a line down the middle. Once you have your line down the middle, draw your line right across the top, leave some room to give a title. That will give you a T-chart. Many of you, I'm guessing, have made these many times before. Right? Then at the top of the T, I would like you on one side to write primary source, on the other, secondary source. Now, at any point in time, if I'm moving too fast in this video, please pause the video, write what you need to catch up, and then keep watching the video. I might move a little bit faster than you can write, but because I can't see you in person, that's just going to have to happen. So you'll have to pause the video, catch up, and then keep going. All right, so let's start by talking about a primary source. A primary source is a description of an event from someone who was there. So anytime you hear about an event from a person who is at the event, that is an example of a primary source. A primary source can also be something that was used by the person who was at the event. All right, so let's talk about some examples of each. Our first example of each, we're going to talk about some examples of primary sources. We'll get to secondary sources here in a little bit. So our first example of a primary source is an artifact. An artifact is anything that was used by a person at a specific event. So for one example that many people have found in Ohio is arrowheads. Arrowheads are the tip of spears that Native Americans used to hunt with. Now, if you were to go in your backyard and dig up an arrowhead, I don't suggest that. Your parents might get mad at you. But if you were to find an arrowhead somewhere buried underground, it would probably be an example of a primary source because it would have been used by Native Americans hundreds of years ago to actually hunt. Now, another example, I spelled that wrong. There we go. All right, now it's spelled correctly. Another example is a diary or journal. Diaries or journals are stories that people keep about themselves, right? Usually people write in a diary or journal at the end of the day and just write down a few things that happened during the day. Many times you will find these in with war veterans or people who help serve in the war, like nurses. They'll keep diaries of what happened that day during the war. If you were to read one of these, this would be an example of a primary source because the person who wrote it was actually there to experience the war or whatever event that it was happening at the time. Next is kind of going along with the diary journal, but a little bit longer. It is an autobiography. Autobiographies are stories that people write about themselves to tell others about their lives. And because that person was actually there to experience their life, this is a primary source. The difference between journals and autobiographies is autobiographies usually capture an entire person's life, whereas journal entries usually capture 1 or 2 days at a time, maybe a week. Next up is speeches. Speeches are a great example of a primary source because they're told by people who were at events. A great example of that is Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Martin Luther King, his speech was talking about making sure every person has freedom, no matter the color of their skin. Now, he was actually in this southern states and experienced how poorly African Americans were treated. So he was there to experience, and because he was the one who gave the speech, it was a primary source. Next up, I guess the last example are photos or videos. So photos or videos, they're taken by people who are at an event, and they capture a moment of time where they're at events. That can, like I said, that can either be photos or videos. Either way, they're primary sources. All right, now let's talk a little bit about a secondary source. A secondary source is a description of an event based on research or told by someone who was not there to see, right? So anytime you have a resource or a source that was told by someone who wasn't there, they had to do their research to learn about the event, that would be a secondary source. So once again, some examples are textbooks. Our textbook that I was just reading to you from, for example, is the Ohio Adventure, right? That is an example of a of a secondary source, because Mary Stockwell, the author, was not actually at the majority, if any, of these events that she's telling us about. She had to do research and read other stories and hear stories from that people told her to be able to write the textbook. Okay? The next example of a secondary source is a biography. Biographies are similar to autobiographies. The difference is it is the story of a person's life told by another person. So because that person writing the biography was not actually there to experience that person's life, it is a secondary source. They had to do research or talk to the person to figure out different parts of their life. Next up is informational texts. Informational texts, what they are, they're books, they're articles, they're passages, even magazines, anything that is written about other people or other pieces of information. So you could have an informational text about the United States. Those are considered secondary sources because the people writing them had to do research on them. This is an informational text here about Thomas Edison. It's not necessarily an autobiography because it's not telling about his life, it's telling about the inventions he made. All right, so telling us about the inventions, the author of this book wasn't the one who invented the stuff. He had to do research on those inventions, so it's a secondary source. Next up, and the last example, are replicas. Replicas are things that are made to look like originals. So for example, we talked about artifacts and arrowheads a few minutes ago. If you were to go out and find an arrowhead and then try to make one of your own, the one that you make would be a replica. It isn't a true primary source because it wasn't being used by people hundreds of years ago. It was made recently, right? Those are examples of secondary sources because, once again, They weren't used by people who were there to see it, right? So you might be asking yourself, all right, so I kind of get this, but if I were to be given a source, I don't know that I would be able to tell if it's a secondary or primary source. So I have a question for you to ask yourself every time you have to determine the difference. So ask yourself, remember, you're still writing what I'm writing. Was the person telling the account present at the event? If you hear a story, or you find an artifact, or you find a replica of something, just ask yourself, was the person who's telling this, was the person who was using this present at whatever event that it was, right? Simple question to figure out if it's primary or secondary. If the person was there or was used or did use it, it would be a primary source. If they weren't there or they had to do research on how it was used, it was a secondary source, right? So these are all the notes we have to take for today. Here in just a second, I'm gonna switch over to a PowerPoint that will go through some different examples. If you still need to copy anything, please pause the video right now, finish copying it, and then press play, watch the rest of the video with us. So, oh no, sneak peek. All right, so this has a bunch of pictures and examples of different primary and secondary sources in this PowerPoint, right? So the directions. Each slide will have a picture and short description of a source. Your job is to write on your paper whether the source is a primary or secondary source based on the information we learned today, all right? Now, you can write it on your paper. I will also have questions popping up on the video that you will need to answer along the way. Right? So the first example is an arrowhead from a tribe 500 years ago. I want you to figure out, was this a primary source or a secondary source? At the bottom, the video is going to pause. You'll have a question to answer. You'll just tell me whether it's primary or secondary. All right, this is a primary source because it was used by someone hundreds of years ago. Next up, we have a biography about Albert Einstein. Once again, at the bottom, the video pause, tell me, was this a primary source, or is this a primary source or a secondary source? This is a secondary source. Once again, the word biography here. A biography is something that is written about another person because that's the person writing it wasn't there to experience that person's life. It is a secondary source. Next, we have a journal from a Civil War nurse. Now, this is a what? Tell me at the bottom. This is a primary source. I almost said secondary. That wouldn't have been good. This is a primary source because it is written by a person who is actually there to see the event. They were actually in the Civil War helping people heal during the war. All right, remember, journal or diary, that's the key word there. Next, a World War II, the uniform worn by a soldier in World War I. Wow, it would be helpful if I would just slow down to read the sentence a little bit. All right, so is this a primary or secondary source? This is a primary source because once again, it was worn by someone who was actually there. They actually fought in World War I. Next, we have something I already gave you the answer to, but let's see if you remember. Your Ohio history textbook, is that an example of a primary or secondary source? It is an example of a secondary source because once again, the author, Mary Stockwell, was not actually there to experience many of the events, if not all the events that she writes in this book. All right, again, something I gave you an answer to. Let's see if you were paying attention. A replica arrowhead of a fourth grader made, right? So if a fourth grader took this arrowhead and made it, is it took a piece of rock and made this arrowhead, would that be a primary, secondary source? Tell me at the bottom. This is a secondary source because once again, it was not used by people in the past to actually hunt. It was just a replica of something that was. Next, Grandparents showing pictures and telling stories from their childhood. At the bottom, tell me, secondary or primary? This is a primary source because the grandparents telling the stories and showing the pictures. Remember, pictures is a primary source. They were actually there to experience the events of their childhood. So it's a primary source. Next, we have a 300-year-old bow and arrow. Primary or secondary? Tell me at the bottom. This is a primary source because it was actually used to hunt hundreds of years ago when by a Native American. And I'm sorry, this isn't last. We have two more. A Civil War reenactment. Is this primary or secondary? Tell me at the bottom. This is a secondary source because these people who are acting out the Civil War, they were not actually there to experience the Civil War. They did their research to find out what happened, to put on shows and show other people what happened. Now we have the last one. All right, a picture of New York City with the Twin Towers. Back when the Twin Towers were still standing and now when they have the Freedom Tower. Is this picture of New York City an example of a primary source or secondary source? Tell me at the bottom. This is an example of a primary source because remember, picture, all right? Now, this whole time I've been talking about primary sources being hundreds of years old. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that all primary sources are hundreds of years old. For example, this could have been taken a couple days ago, but because it is a picture of an actual event, this is the actual New York City skyline, that is an example of a primary source, right? So that is all I have for you today for primary and secondary sources on this video. Once you are done, what I would like you to do is go over and back to your assignments or modules and I have a short quiz for you to take. I have a bunch of different examples of primary and secondary sources. Again, you're just gonna have to tell me which is which. If you want to use your notes, that way you get them correct, that would be awesome. I wanna make sure you guys know these because like I said in the beginning of the video, we're gonna be doing this all year, talking about primary and secondary sources. So go do that. You guys have a wonderful day. We will see you for our next lesson next Friday.